What happens when you take Bloodborne's setting and transform it into an alternate version of a major real-life historical event, and you replace all the beasts with robots? You get Steelrising. Released back in September of last year, Steelrising is developer Spider's first attempt at the Soulslike genre, and it's a game that definitely wears its inspiration on its sleeve. While the story itself has its historical inspirations, the way the decimated city of Paris is presented and the gameplay itself will no doubt remind you of FromSoftware's magnum opus. So, how does it compare to not only the genre as a whole, but one of the genre's best? My name's Johnny Bueno, and let's take a look at Steelrising. In Steelrising, you'll take control of Aegis, Queen Marie Antoinette's personal automaton bodyguard and fashion icon, who is sent on a mission to put an end to King Louis XVI's reign of terror and an alternate version of the French Revolution. Along her journey, Aegis will meet many of the individuals who are rebelling against the king, all of whom are based on real-life historical figures. And they all talk to you like real human beings rather than your typical cryptic Souls-like NPCs. Surprising, I know, but a nice change of pace for once, especially when the voice acting is actually pretty good.
Seigneur, vos consciences dance. You're conscious too, and yet you're not one of the Count's creatures, n'est-ce pas?
I do not know, monsieur.
While they might not be the most exciting NPCs aesthetically, I mean they're just a bunch of old dudes in powdered wigs, the voice actors in Steelrising do a great job leaning into each of their unique personalities. In addition to the NPCs, the story is also presented through the usual notes scattered throughout the world, but more interestingly, there are unique items that you'll find lying around that give you a short flashback cutscene, showing past events happening from the point of view of whoever left that item behind. This is a pretty unique way of approaching character building for the genre, and I actually liked it a lot. I don't need to read a bunch of notes, let me actually see what happened to a certain character to understand their place in the plot. Paris itself looks amazing as you trek through its winding streets, vast palace courtyards, lush gardens, and a deep mine. While several zones do take place in the more crowded heart of the city, I think the game does a nice job of giving each area a unique presentation to set them apart from one another. What really stood out for me was the architecture of the various manors and palaces, which were beautifully presented even if they were overrun by robots and were full of corpses. You may find yourself repeatedly visiting these places as well, since Steelrising features a number of trackable side quests to complete. Overall, though, I didn't find the majority of them that engaging, and the rewards didn't even seem to be that great either, but they do provide some extra story tidbits. The game does make tracking the main and side quests relatively easy though, as you're given a compass item that will point the way to your objectives. The winding streets of Paris can be pretty tough to navigate, so this was an addition that I appreciated quite a bit. Sure, it may somewhat ruin the sense of discovery, but I'd rather not spend hours trying to remember which hidden alley I found an NPC in so I could carry on with the game. One thing that immediately became apparent within the first few minutes of playing Steelrising is that the combat feels slow and stiff. If you've played any other modern Souls-like before trying out Steelrising, Aegis' strikes will feel incredibly sluggish. I actually felt like I had to readjust my own tempo in combat to be more in line with something like Dark Souls 1, as opposed to the quicker, snappier combat of, say, Elden Ring. And I get it, Aegis and her many enemies are 18th century automatons, so they realistically wouldn't be able to move all that fluidly. But I don't think slowing down the gameplay to fit the automaton aesthetic is doing Steelrising any favors, as it makes it feel more in line with games in the genre from a decade ago, as opposed to more modern Souls-likes that have become much more faster paced. There is an interesting mechanic that does help the combat feel a little quicker in the form of the rapid cooling mechanic. When you expend Aegis' stamina bar, you'll get a brief window where, with a well-timed button press, you can immediately restore some or all of her stamina to keep you in the fight longer. The caveat is, when you do use rapid cooling, Aegis will be hit with a freeze debuff, and if you rapid cool too many times in succession, she'll become temporarily frozen. I like this type of risk versus reward system, as I'm always a sucker for being rewarded for my aggression and watching enemies buckle under a string of blows without having to worry about recharging my stamina. Moving on to the weapons of Steelrising, there's actually a pretty decent variety of weapons to choose from, ranging from claws, muskets, hammers, and several more. Each weapon will come with a special ability like a parry counter or a special range attack that add a little more flavor beyond the standard light and strong attacks. I love the steampunk-inspired design of Steelrising's weapons, and I typically found myself trying on each weapon and testing out their attacks, even if they weren't particularly useful for my build. Every weapon also has a charge attack that, with my heavier weapon-focused build, felt borderline broken and a little cheesy. I was actually able to completely stun-lock one of the game's bosses just by chaining together charge attacks and repeatedly staggering them. Since your stamina will continue to replenish while you're charging up your charge attack, you can do this over and over and over again, and I absolutely abused the crap out of this during my playthrough. And no, I don't feel bad about it. Enemy variety in Steelrising is pretty decent. You'll usually find a unique enemy or two in each zone that you haven't seen somewhere else. Some also show up as mini-bosses as stronger versions of their normal counterparts, with a few more tricks up their sleeve that might catch you off guard. Enemies can range from your standard one-trick pony soldiers to the fire-breathing serpents, or those annoyingly aggressive hunters who, despite not having legs, will run you down and beat you into the dirt. I think Steelrising does a good job both in the design department for these enemies, but also in terms of balance, as their attacks are fairly well telegraphed, without too many cheap shots that make you want to throw your controller. When it comes to Steelrising's bosses, they absolutely knock it out of the park with the design and presentation of the Titan bosses you'll face at the end of each zone. What makes their designs especially interesting is that each one is inspired by the profession of the historical figure that powers it. For example, the Bishop is based on Monseigneur de la Fere, a holy man and NPC that eventually joins Aegis to take down the king. The Bishop will chuck his Bible at you and literally beat the word of God into Aegis, and overall I think this has one of the coolest presentations in the game. There's also the Alchemist, powered by another friendly NPC and chemist, Antoine Lavoisier, who will throw multiple types of elemental attacks at Aegis. The designs of the Titans had me incredibly invested and interested in what I would see next, but unfortunately they fall pretty flat in terms of difficulty. Most of them appear to attack very slowly and sometimes infrequently, leaving me with plenty of openings to knock them down with a charge attack. They also appear to stagger a little too easily. As I mentioned before, I was able to sunlock one of the bosses to death with a string of charge attacks without even getting touched once. I thought that this was incredibly disappointing as the designs were so stellar that I was hoping they would have the difficulty to match. But I probably died to a Titan boss once or twice during my entire playthrough. One final note on the gameplay, Steelrising does feature some surprisingly okay platforming for a Soulslike. Aegis will unlock a few different platforming abilities as you play through the game, including a mid-air dash and the ability to use a grappling hook. These do make traversing areas a little more interesting, and it adds a level of vertical exploration to each zone. It even gives you a reason to go back to previous areas, as you'll find some parts of each zone that are initially blocked off. You'll also be keeping an eye out for various rooftops and balconies you can travel across to potentially find some interesting loot, and overall, I thought this feature was pretty well implemented, especially in a genre that's not well known for its platforming. As far as progression goes in Steelrising, there's really not a ton to talk about that separates it from your typical Souls-like game. You'll collect anima essence from defeating enemies and spend them on upgrading Aegis' different stats and weapons. You have 6 stats to choose from, both offensive and defensive, and a cap of 20 points can be allocated to each one. The game doesn't do a very good job of explaining how each stat upgrade affects your character, but for the most part each one is pretty self-explanatory if you just look at the bottom of the screen to see where the green arrow appears. I found myself pumping most of my points into power for damage with my primary weapon, as well as durability and vigor to boost my health and stamina, and I had zero issues with feeling like I didn't allocate my stat points appropriately. Although I think it's hard to mess up a simple Oonga Boonga me smash with big weapons strength build. Weapon upgrades work through the usual system of collecting specific upgrade items like bronze and iron, found throughout the world to rank up your weapons from +1 to +2, all the way up to +5. These items seemed too few and far between earlier in the game, but by the end I had more of them than I knew what to do with. Which is kind of nice, as it gave me the opportunity to upgrade and experiment with other weapons without needing to farm too much. Steelrising also features a module system, which is nearly identical to the Carol Rune system from Bloodborne. Modules essentially give Aegis various bonuses to how she performs in combat, and you can equip up to 4 modules, which are split into 3 tiers, with each being more effective than the previous tier. These bonuses can include increased endurance, restoring health on critical strikes, and reducing freeze buildup with rapid cooling. Many of these modules can be found from defeating mini-bosses or opening chests, so a bit of exploration is encouraged if you're looking to optimize your modules and overall build. I will say that modules do feel fairly impactful on how you play the game, but overall it's not too exciting as it's something we've already seen before. This isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, as the developers are clearly trying to play it safe, and there's just nothing unique that makes how you customize Aegis stand out from other titles in the genre. So overall, what did Steelrising excel at, and what wasn't so great? For the positives, Paris is presented beautifully with several unique and interesting zones and some rather beautiful architecture. Solid voice acting that helps give the NPCs inhabiting Paris some life. Good character building with the inclusion of Aegis being able to see the memories of other characters when she comes in contact with the item they left behind. Decent weapon variety that actually makes finding and testing out new weapons fairly exciting. Platforming feels fluid and encourages a greater level of exploration. And the absolutely stellar boss design for the Titans will have you wondering what kind of robotic monstrosity you will encounter next. For the negatives, the combat is slow and somewhat clunky, making it feel similar to Souls-likes you may have played a decade ago. Most side quests didn't feel very engaging, and the rewards for completing them were hardly worth the effort. Titan bosses were incredibly easy to defeat, despite their impressive presentation. And the progression in Steelrising is fairly bland, offering nothing that we haven't seen already several times before. While Steelrising didn't necessarily do anything overly unique, it still provided an incredibly solid Souls-like experience with its unique enemy designs and gritty yet beautiful setting rooted in history. And honestly, I'm okay with getting more Bloodborne-inspired games like this until FromSoftware gives us a sequel in 20 to 30 years. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and let me know what you think in the comments below. I appreciate every bit of interaction and support, as I love making videos like this. So, please subscribe if you want to see more, and thank you for watching.